Good evening and welcome. The title of tonight's presentation begins with the words dreaming the present, and it is apropos. Tonight is the first Caxton Club evening program since February 19th, 2020. The Caxton Club has been dreaming this present would arrive, and we are delighted to share this evening with Dr. Hunt, his distinguished guests, and the launch of his new book. And now, it is my honor to introduce the editor of the Caxtonian, Michael Gorman, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I am Michael Gorman, and I am the editor of the Caxtonian. It is a special pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Irvin J. Hunt. You will remember his excellent review article for the May-June 2021 Caxtonian. Dr. Hunt is a professor in the English department of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's a graduate of Morehouse College, holds a master's degree from Berkeley, a PhD from Columbia, and received a postdoctoral research fellowship from Rutgers. As a side note, Doug Fitzgerald will be very happy to supply you with the nicknames of the sports teams of each of those illustrious institutions. Dr. Hunt's research interests are 20th century and contemporary African American cultural history, cooperative economics, humor studies, social movement theory, performance studies, and affect theory. Among the courses he has taught are the American novel since 1914, Black literature in America from the beginnings to today, and the intriguing sounding Morning in Comic Time. Our speaker has published widely in a number of scholarly journals, including American Literature, Post 45, and American Literary Quarterly. His book, Dreaming the Present, Time, Aesthetics, and the Black Cooperative Movement, published by the University of North Carolina Press, forms the basis of his talk tonight, in which he will tell us how Ella Baker, George Schuyler, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Fannie Lou Hamer built networks of mutual aid, and, with great relevance to our present dark times, tells us not only how the story of their accomplishments helps us to understand who these remarkable people were and what a social movement is, but also how to care for each other in the here and now. It is my privilege and my pleasure to introduce Dr. Irvin Hunt.
I want to start by saying thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. Jackie, thank you for this incredible invitation. I have enjoyed being a member of the Caxton Club. I've enjoyed particularly these talks, and it's a great honor to be able to contribute to the archive of these talks. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the Q&A after this both virtual and live discussion. I began this book in 2014 in the wake of the loss of Mike Brown and Ferguson. I was searching at that time for an alternative to hope, because hope just felt like something I couldn't depend on reliably anymore. And in that search, this book is what I found. I remember reading a letter from Fannie Lou Hamer's neighbor, in which she said, "Hope me something." And that phrase, "hope me something," hit me like a light, because I never thought of hope in those terms before. For me, hope was something that you looked forward to. It was about a future that awaited you, not about something in the present right here, not about being immediately fulfilled now. that is the hope I found. And that's the hope, that kind of now hope that carried me through. And I think carried a lot of these people who I talk about in the book through in their fight to establish cooperatives. But at the time, I didn't know what cooperatives were. I was reading as a graduate student randomly through Black newspapers and magazines, and I was seeing this word cooperative come up over and over again in the most intense connotations, life or death kind of stakes. This is an article from the Crisis magazine titled Exploitation or Cooperation, Death, basically, or Life. And it was awarded in 1918 Best Essay in Economics of the Year. I saw the most renowned cartoonist of his day, E. Sims Campbell, talking about colored buying power and satirizing its use in the wrong place, which was connected to cooperatives. Atlanta Daily World, I read cooperative movement gains support in this country. And I thought cooperative movement, there's a huge movement going on. And I wanted to make sense of that. The Baltimore Afro-American was saying that it could be the savior. Cooperative movement seemed needed in the South. Cooperation is salvation. And of course, there was a huge contention around what this would do for Black folks and the impoverished. So the Liberator said, this is not salvation. This is a new beacon of betrayal. Consumer cooperatives will not smash Jim Crow. The Chicago Defender was talking about not just cooperative banks or cooperative grocery stores, but entire cooperative society. How about 100% cooperatives? On the heels of the Negro Star, saying co-ops are Negroes' best bet for economic democracy. And then I came to this book by an Alabama bookstore owner by the name of Ben Fowkes. And he decided to write almost 300 pages of rhymes in devotion, a kind of rhapsody to the cooperatives that were flowering in his area. And these were fun rhymes. They were, jump rope rhymes. They carry oysters, salmons, and clams. They carry Swift's best premium hams. They carry Van Camp's pork and beans, American and imported sardines. And so suddenly I saw that whatever these cooperatives were, they were also a source not only of political ferment and activism, but creative energy. And that led on to me seeing that, wow, not just little known writers like Ben Fowkes were talking about cooperatives, but some of our most canonical Black writers, Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Ann Petrie, Margaret Walker, and the list went on. And I was like, my goodness, okay, so what are these things? So cooperatives, I've quickly learned, were businesses owned by their makers. They were a way for folks to pool their resources and create greater economic and political power than they could on their own. So pooling meager resources, democratically owned businesses, organizations. And that was the economic definition and the technical definition that was in use at the time. But there was also another definition that was also super interesting to me. And this was a definition that had everything to do with a different kind of history, a different place in time. Cooperatives were talked about as a new era, inaugurating a new era. And this in conjunction with one of the phrases from a manifesto by the Young Negroes Cooperative League, which we're going to get to in a second, in which the cooperatives are for right now, in big capital letters, right now. And the capitalization of those letters took what would be simply cooperatives for urgency, for immediate needs, to cooperatives for the creation of a new order of time. And that is the definition, and that's the understanding that excited me and what I decided I wanted to write about in this book. It came together in this phrase by Alethea Washington, cooperatives being a fourth alternative. there is a fourth alternative, economic cooperation. And she's talking about an alternative to communism, capitalism, and fascism. And what's interesting about that is all of those are isms, and then you set those words side by side together with co-op, and you realize, wait, as an ism, we're thinking of, or I'm thinking of, a huge grand historical narrative, maybe a utopian future, utopian goals, next to something smaller, something that's just asymmetrical, doesn't align with that huge narrative of history, co-ops. So that indicated to me that this was about a new place in time, a new understanding of time. And the question that I felt like they were asking, that I saw them asking, was a really difficult one to wrap my head around. And what I tried to do throughout the book, which was, how do you make a movement that doesn't try to create or isn't invested in a narrative of historical progress? Movements we think of as taking us to a better tomorrow. What does it mean for a movement to take us to a bigger today, a huge capitalized right now? So that was the question, and that from there I learned so much about activism, and so much that has kept my motivation and my sense of political hope, and a different kind of hope, going. I was surprised that no book had existed other than Jessica Nembhard's Collective Courage on a history of cooperatives, which were so central to Black life, for Blacks being able to feed themselves, bury their dead, mourn their loved ones, etc. And yet there was only one exhaustive history on this incredible resource for Black folks in this country. And I didn't want to tell an exhaustive history. I wanted to tell a story about that question of, how do you persist toward impossible ends? How do you keep the motivation going? And so my history in the book begins with the largest Black organization in US history at the time, and its collapse. And that organization was the Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union. It was founded in 1886 in Texas. And by 1890, it had corralled about 1.2 million members across every Southern state. But by 1891, it disappeared. And I mean that in a way where, there were forces that made it disappear. I read about this event that the Black press was calling a massacre. And that was in 1889, while this alliance was posing a real threat, not just to white capital, but the entire notion of private property. Folks, their main leaders in LaFleur, Mississippi, were attacked by not only white vigilantes, but also the National Guard, and they were gunned down. Their families were gunned down, and the organizational center in LaFleur, Mississippi for the Alliance dispersed and sort of dissolved. And that was the beginning of the end. By beginning here and then going into the movement, how the movement resurged in the 20th century, the question was, how does one remain politically active in the wake of such loss? How does one persist toward impossible ends? This question of persistence was very much on the mind of one of the biggest thinkers in African-American life, W.E.B. Du Bois. And I knew Du Bois as someone who had and promoted big ideas about the future, someone who was mapping something as large as a world revolution, someone who wanted to create a broad system of socialism across the Black diaspora and indeed across the world. And so he was very much in line with grand narrative thinkers. That wasn't the Du Bois, however, that I encountered in these cooperatives and in his effort to create what he would call the Negro Cooperative Guild in 1918, where he brought together some of the leading activists and minds in economic cooperation, including James Peter Warbossy, who was the president of the Cooperative League of America, and decided that he was going to try to create a network of cooperatives that would stretch not only throughout the U.S. but outside of it into the Caribbean and Latin America. That's as far as he got. But eventually, he helped establish about 5 cooperative stores in Tennessee, cooperative grocery stores in Tennessee, and a few other things. But the real golden nugget for me in this history was the way he approached activism in the first place. So he was able to corral an incredible amount of support for his guild, and people were writing him that heard about the guild. People who were writing him from Hampton University, who also wanted to offer some help in establishing a center of study to study economic cooperation. Why haven't you gone further with this? What are you doing with these resources? And one interpretation of all this was he was afraid to fail, and he felt like he just needed to get just a little bit more so that if the project were attacked, it would be able to hold up. So, it could be Du Bois sort of in a kind of stasis, Hamleting in a kind of delay, and in a fear of failure in the end. And that's one interpretation. But the way I saw it was I saw him really trying to fashion an activism that was all about beginning, all about the idea that the point is not to achieve certain ends. The point is to begin again and again and again. And I saw that in everything, including in the aesthetic of the stores themselves. And I think this is where Du Bois, to whatever extent he had a hand in creating or designing or just even appreciating the aesthetic of these shops. These are two different grocery stores in Tennessee. This is Du Bois bringing out his novelistic imagination and showing us the importance of thinking of politics and art, or activism and art, side by side. I'm going to read just one description of these stores as I see it. The resemblance between the pictures of Roddy's stores, which themselves were called pictures from other periodicals, suggested they were part of a bigger genre of cooperative aesthetics. These images implied almost uniformly that the experience of the co-op denatured the allure of shopping. The buzzing frenzy of options for newly nuanced needs. With their repetition of basic goods, as Du Bois would call them, flour, meal, and meats, sugar, coffee, teas, etc., an echolalia of cans neatly queued and stacked on shelves behind the cashier, then pyramidized like a war hall in the middle of the shop. With this repetition, cooperative stores left you supplied, if not satisfied. They attempted to change the requisites of personal satisfaction along with the borders and basis of the wanting self. Could you slake your desires with just a few things? Could you question and revise what you really needed? Could the desire to support others, the merchant, the members, the future members, occupy as much space as the desire to support yourself? This was the paradox of the unselfish consumer co-op, a movement downward and inward, spelled an enormous movement out. And that had everything to do, the aesthetics, I believe, had everything to do with this idea of beginning and continually beginning the point in and of itself, where I thought of it in terms of a sort of broader life lesson of where we find value, not in the value that death gives to life, but in the value that beginning gives to life. The meaning of life not deriving its value from the fact that things end, but the fact that things begin and begin again and again. I gained even more lessons on activism from the work that George Schuyler did on the shoulders of Du Bois, along with his partner in crime, Ella Baker. I knew George Schuyler when I started. I knew him as a novelist. He was a satirist and the most widely known Black journalist of his day. He had written the first speculative fiction novel, Black No More. But I didn't know that he also was this activist, this organizer, and I didn't know about any of the work that he was doing or had done with Ella Baker. I knew Ella Baker in the way that Howard Zinn had described her in 1960 when he was honoring her her work in the civil rights movement as one of the most consequential and yet one of the least honored people in America. I knew that she had helped King and his organization, which, you know, maybe we shouldn't call it his organization, but Southern Christian Leadership Conference, how it was really her organizational work and in Atlanta that helped this get off the ground and fulfill its campaign promises. And she said that she ran this organization out of her pocketbook and a telephone booth, you know, so she was really doing some behind the scenes work, not even given an office. I knew also that she had played an essential role in establishing SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and this role that she played, you know, listening to young folks and sort of mentoring them and figuring out how they could realize their vision. That was super central to how to the role that SNCC would play in the freedom rides and the voting rights campaigns that they launched in Mississippi and throughout the South. So I knew her in that way. But when she arrived in Harlem, I quickly came to realize was already a consequential figure. She arrived in her late 1920s. She teamed up with Schuyler to establish what they called in 1930 the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And this was a league that in just a handful of years, about 3 years, did an enormous amount of work in establishing certain cooperative groups and businesses. They had a cooperative farm in Georgetown, Pennsylvania. They established one of the longest lasting cooperative stores in Buffalo, New York. On that farm, there were residence quarters for 5 families who were on relief. And there was a number of other things like newspaper stands and milk distribution groups that they created, not to mention the 22 councils across about 26 or 27 cities across the US. Councils were these groups that would then go on to create cooperatives in their local area. So there was a huge amount of activity and stuff that they managed to do in a small amount of years. And that attracted me. That was incredibly fascinating. But in addition to that, and probably even more so, was the kind of activism that they practiced that I wanted to talk about here. Also, Schuyler went over to England to make alliances with the largest cooperative store there. And he also tried to drum up support in the West Indies, just to give a sense that this was not US bound, it was transnational. But where everything sort of opened up for me was in their manifesto. So this was an appeal to young Negroes, as George Schuyler called it. And I believe that Ella Baker had a hand in thinking about this particular bylaw, which totally changed the script for me about how I saw social movements. In this bylaw, you can read, no person under 16 or over 35 years of age shall be accepted for membership except by 2/3 vote. No person under 16 or over 35. Well, Schuyler the following year would be turning 35. And this was laughed at in the Black press by some authors who, for example, one in the Pittsburgh Courier, Schuyler's own paper, said, founder of YNCL plans to retire as soon as program is definitely launched. I mean, it did seem a little ridiculous that their that their president would be excised from the organization by its own bylaw as soon as it came off the ground. But instead of thinking of this as just, oh, a novelist who doesn't know what he's doing in terms of activism, I thought of this as, wait, maybe this is a window into a whole new kind of activism. And what I came to understand was that this was a kind of activism in which failure was embraced, in which the point was not to succeed, but to learn how to fail. And you could hear it also just in the preamble or to the manifesto, where the repetition of young Negroes, the oldsters have failed. The oldsters have failed. This is repeated 9 times in 2 pages. And it becomes a kind of incantation. And when you read it out loud, when I read it out loud, I felt that, failure was coming, like lifting off the page to sort of envelop me. I mean, the words themselves were materializing off the page. And it performed the kind of embrace of failure that I think Ella Baker and George Schuyler would adopt. And the reason that changed everything I understood about social movements for me is because I always understood, I sort of bought into the idea that Black social movements were failed plans. And I thought, this is a story about social movements as planned failures. This parted a curtain also in how I saw Ella Baker's most famous political philosophy, which she called group-centered leadership, as opposed to leader-centered leadership or charismatic leader-centered leadership. It was about what it means to build a movement from the ground up and remain on the ground without erecting new heroes, a vertical structure, a vertical hierarchy. It was about a kind of broad embrace of failure, and failure particularly to the ego itself. One of Baker's most famous statements is when she said, at the end of her life, my ego in all of the things that I did wasn't at stake at any point. And I thought, what does it mean for someone's ego not to be at stake at any point? How do you tell a story about a character without an ego? And how do you honor that person? And so this became a question not only of how we honor Baker today and making sure that we are critical of not simply erecting another charismatic leader or pretending that that's how she wanted to see herself. I remember Nation magazine trying to create drum up support around MLK Day for Ella Baker Day. And I thought, well, is this really the way we honor someone whose ego wasn't at stake at any point? One of the things that this came down to for me in a real way, this idea that these movements were that this movement was a planned failure was if I thought about it in terms of a love for the world that they had, and therefore a need or a desire for its preservation, but also the understanding that the world as they understood it, the world as it existed, had to come to an end in order for that very love to have a chance. It started to make a lot of sense. No one seemed to express more love for the world than Fannie Lou Townsend Hamer. And I want to begin by first inviting Hamer into the room through her favorite song. She loved to sing, "This Little Light of Mine." I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Oh, everywhere I go, Lord, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, everywhere I go, Lord, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, Lord, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. I start here because I think that the sound of that voice, first of all, just does something to me. And to think of all the things that she was able to do and all the life that she was able to bring to folks as someone who had a singing troupe by the name of the Hamerettes, who toured with Bernice Johnson, as you can see here on the right, in the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. But this she's doing all at the same time that she is organizing and campaigning for a new organization that she started known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Her most fabled achievement was helping to integrate the Mississippi Democratic Party largely through this moving testimony that she gave at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, where she described what she faced and literally faced for trying to vote, and the repercussions that beating had on her body is something that she felt throughout the rest of her life. People were deeply moved by that, but I, noticed that we had sort of not totally forgotten, but not given an adequate account of the project that occupied the final decade of her life, her Freedom Farm Cooperative. And this started with an observation that food was being used as a political weapon, that Black poor folks were being starved out for trying to vote. They were being denied access to the commodities program, and then later access to the use of their food stamps, all for trying to vote. And she said, her phrase was, "Food is a political weapon." And this inspired her to create first a pig farm, and that grew into the 680-acre farm that it became under the name of Freedom Farm. But something that this pediatrician by the name of Aaron Shirley said at one of their first meetings really touched me, and I think drove home the urgency of this kind of cooperative. "I see it and it hurts. Children are getting smaller. Their bodies are declining. Their bodies are preparing to die. It's winter," he said, "and their feet are cold." I want to read to you just a brief history of what her farm was able to achieve and where it ended up. In Freedom Farm's best years, 1971 and 2 and 3, it acquired 3 homes for the poorest to live on free of charge. Hamer seemed to consider this a sort of reparations. By December 1972, they bought 70 prefabricated houses, then personally bricked them, bought lots for 75 more, started a sewing factory and an African garment store, a daycare center, Offered high school and college scholarships, not even to mention the miles of food, which at one point reached Chicago as humanitarian aid. Yet, with all of this, Hamer liked to dub her farm under a tongue-in-cheek name, the Little Co-op. I love that because it emphasizes how much humor she had in everything that she did. This grand, this big project being called My Little Co-op. But in the farm's decline, 1974 and 5 and 6 and 7, all manner of weeds devastated the land, lacking money to keep them down. And their principal fundraiser advanced her career in setbacks. In January 1974, they lost all but their first 40 acres to creditors, a diminishment that reflected Hamer's new state of mind. Directly after the loss, she was delivered to her local hospital for what her friends called a nervous breakdown, the exigencies of orating, fundraising, traveling, leadership, diabetes, and hypertension having taxed her nerves beyond what they could bear. For the next 3 years, even after all this, Hamer insisted on holding the farm together despite the constant strain, as if the things that give the most to us must take in equal measure. Beneath a blindingly blue sky on a Sunday afternoon, the 20th of March, 1977, the members of the farm buried their frayed leader among an overflow of grievers. Soon after the funeral, the farm's directors were forced to sell their last 40 acres to the state for $1. For the token of $1, the state forgave their loans. By decade's end, the farm was reduced to the size of a burial plot. The only thing left of Freedom Farm was and would remain the plot Hamer was buried in. Suffice to say, Hamer's Little Co-op might have been less than freedom, but it was always more than a farm. And I want to just close this chapter with a reading of a picture that, to me, rebuts the argument that the farm collapsed because they didn't manage it properly, that it was slapdash, poorly organized, and haphazard. I think that this picture alone, captured by a photographer by the name of Franklin Peterson, suggests a different story. Freedom Farm was a meeting of climactic extremes. In the first 2 years, every image, every budget, every delay in production all bore a testament to the extremely dry conditions, which some workers called drought, some onlookers negligence. One C.V. McTeer followed Foster. This is Miles Foster was the manager of the farm, throughout the farm in July of 1971 and observed that due to serious lack of irrigation, much of the crop is being burned to waste by the sun. When I look at this picture of the cotton crop taken before McTeer or any cotton had arrived, a gray patina of dust layered on all the leaves, as though the smallest gust of wind would whip up a dust cloud as far as the eye could see. I wonder how anything grew at all. Foster strides ahead of the camera, thigh high in the papery foliation of this first crop of cotton. Through Peterson's underexposed Kodachrome technique, the camera captures him almost two-dimensionally. Foster appears to have lost his legs, to be hovering lightly as the dust, just above the leaves, and like the dust, to be disappearing en masse into a vast, shadowy center of tiny remains. I look again at Foster. Something about the strangeness of this photo, him fast nearing a point of total dissipation, seemingly nearing it fast enough that had the photographer waited another second to release his shutter, Foster might have been gone. This general unreality makes me notice something else may be stranger yet. Foster could not be dressed more incongruously with the backdrop. Appareled top to bottom in a perfectly placed fedora, its rim descending as smoothly as an aircraft above the diamond in his right ear. And then his collared shirt, buttoned tightly at the wrist, is tidily tucked into his belted trousers. The only aberration to his finely tuned attire is a recently used handkerchief, white, mottled, and clambering out of his back pocket. If on the one hand he seems to be vanishing into the dust, on the other he seems to be fighting mightily against it. He is clearly stopped at nothing to express the dignity of his office. In fact, as stoically serene as his voice always sounds on tape, it seems this dignity in the shell of his clothes may be the only thing left holding him together. It is impossible for me to look at this picture and not recall the remark made a year after it was taken that Freedom Farms had entered a zone of disenchantment. They were very disenchanted about growing vegetables because of the problems they have run into, said the donor, Martha Smith. One is inclined to say, against the accusations of a haphazardness and managerial informality, that if not for their decorum in the face of their troubles, they would have dissolved into nothing no sooner than they began. In the end, I think that the book comes down to a poem that is the epigraph of one of the chapters, and it's from Gwendolyn Brooks, and it's in her 1973 collection, Blacks, and it's a speech to the young, she calls it. And the end of the poem goes, live not for battles won, live not for the end of the song, live in the along. And I think all of these figures, with their art and their activism combined, tell us in more ways than one how we can live in the along and how long that living can be. I want to thank Betty Saar for allowing me to use her assemblage, The Weight of Persistent Racism. And this just perfectly captured for me the three concepts of time, the three ways I'm thinking about the present throughout the book. And I also want to thank all the independent bookstores who are promoting my book. And thank you for The Word Is Change, a Brooklyn bookstore, for setting my book on their shelf beside some of my biggest inspirations, Robin D.G. Kelly and Keonga Yamada Taylor, Cedric Robertson. I say all this also to say we got to support our independent bookstores. Thank you so much for this time, and let's get to the Q&A.
How did this movement that you described fit into the movements that so many of us know so well? You talked about the Southern Leadership Conference.
Yeah.
And SNCC, and things that some of us kind of grew up with or came of age.
Yeah.
How did this movement, how was it seen by others, other activists in America?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think what this history that I tell does is give us a different lens to seeing the poster child of a social movement, the civil rights movement. And I think it gives us a different lens because I really wanted to use this opportunity to tell a different story, to make us rethink what we think when we think of a social movement. And the civil rights movement is really key because people look back on that. A lot of scholars, a lot of historians look back on that with grim eyes. It didn't fulfill its economic goals. It's told often in history as a sad story. And I think what cooperatives do and what the cooperative movement does is help us think about what it means for a social movement to succeed and what value we place, what is the requirement of success. Is the requirement of success that we meet the goals? Is the requirement of success that we last? what's a different kind of criteria for success? And I think that, you know, I closely examined this, but I do think it has a lot of insight to impart to how we think of other movements that first come to mind when we think of an American or leftist or sort of radical movement in and of itself. But that would be another book that hopefully I'll have the lifespan to write.
I believe my question is more so on your creative process, because you did share that you began this in 2014.
Yeah.
And it's been sort of a evolution, if you will. You mentioned Mike Brown around that time. That was like right after Trayvon Martin. Fast forward to 2020, George Floyd.
Yeah.
And now in a time where the world is still, and we're forced to see this on a world stage. So I'm just kind of curious to your creative process. Was this something that you began, and as time went on, like, did you get propelled as these events took place, or just how was your creative process in getting to this finished product?
You know, this stuff is heavy, right? I think, you know, creative process, it was really important for me to have fun. It was really every day I would think about, I would write down, copy out some poetry. I'd copy out some way that I saw an author playing on the page, and I would say, all right, could I play in that way today? Because I found that for the first 2 years, you know, when I say I started this in 2014, the better, you know, the more accurate ways, I started years before and I just couldn't get it started. And it wasn't until I figured out how to play on the page, how to lighten it up, that I was able to tell the story. And lighten it up for me just meant experimenting with the prose. How can I make these sentences jump out at me and make me, you know, transport me to another thing that's not simply the threat, that's not simply the weight of the theory or the weight of the concept that I'm after, but something that's actually, you know, actually heavier by being lighter, you know. So yeah.
So Irvin, it's Joyce Gibson. Roland and I are here. So
I want to applaud you again, Irvin, for remarkable work. I had read parts of it before, and
can you hear me?
Speak in the mic.
There you go.
Got it. I want to ask you a question about intellectual history.
No, but I started. You said those live here.
What you just said.
Yeah.
And what I see you did in the book as intellectual history on different levels. One, I want you to reflect on your foundational educational experience at Morehouse, under the tutelage of Benjamin Mays and all that represents. Because my sense today is we don't really school our students at that level of intellectual history. I mean, the exposure to poets, to essayists, to novelists. And the second level I want to ask you about is intellectual history in terms of trying to mine the stories of the masses. Because I think we all sat here marveling at the photographs, the quotes, which also come out of a deep reservoir of historical experience that people get exposed to, but we don't always mine their knowledge so that it gets produced in a way that subsequent generations can draw on it. So what I saw going on in what you've done is a deeper mining of that broad and deep experience with sensibilities honed in your own education that pointed you and got you excited about what all of that represented. So.
Gosh, that's intellectual history. married to how I, to Morehouse. Yeah, Morehouse was the first time in my life that I felt like I could think without the glare of racism. It was the first time in my life that I felt like I could think and not be afraid of speaking in class. And it was the only time. I left and that was it. And I think the book was an attempt to, in a lot of ways, recreate that space. It's going to be a long time before I'm able to answer how the intellectual history that came by way of Benjamin E. Mays and all my mentors at Morehouse really filtered in through to this. But I can say that if not for Morehouse, and if not for that space, if not for the ability that these activists performed in creating such spaces for themselves, I mean, that's really what this is about. It really, I mean, to work in the along, it's really what it's about, creating an alternative space in which they can just be free to be themselves and do their thing. And that in and of itself is the reason to applaud it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
We don't have any more live questions. Okay, one more live question, and then we'll switch to Zoom.
Your talk was awesome. Thank you so much. Really, really wonderful. I'm going to give you an easier question than the chair of your department. I knew you'd ask the toughest question.
I'm going to think about that on the way to associate.
You did a gorgeous close reading of one of the photographs in which I felt like your literary training was alive and well. There was another incredible photograph, the one of Hamer, when you were talking basically about how much she worked and how she died.
Yeah.
That is an amazing photograph. I mean, a lot of this work, a lot of the photographs, a lot of the archival images, I mean, it just is incredible. So I'm curious about that photograph in particular, but maybe more largely you can talk about what archives were you working in? Where did you find all of this material? How hard was it to find? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so first, those photographs are the first time they will appear in print in this book, and they're by a famous photographer by the name of Lou Draper, who went down to Mississippi to capture what was going on the farm, and they're housed at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And I just happened upon them actually at the end of the project, which was amazing. But the photographs, I visited almost 30 archives. I mean, when I went through the list, when I had to do my footnoting and all that stuff, and had to list I couldn't believe, I was like, I that's right. The wealth of material that is out there made me feel at the end like this was just a small drop in the sea, and it was almost like an introduction to another book, just from how much I had to discard, just what I couldn't get to. But there's this other thing about how we interpret archives and how we interpret archival material that I was trying to push back on. And that is, it bothered me in certain ways, and I understood it in other ways. The reason I went to these particular archives was in order to invite us to think about how we can see activism without having to see a rational end in it. How they're interpreted under like a logic of pragmatism. And I wanted to sort of do a kind of counterintuitive approach, a counterintuitive reading that would give us more access to maybe some of the imagination, some of the dream work that was going on in something as like organizing a conference, or, you know, something that seems incredibly pragmatic and just incredibly humdrum. And so I went to particular archives that were used to tell more traditional stories in order to think about how we might think of archiving and the interpretation of archival historical material differently.
We just have a couple of questions on Zoom before you can relax and eat your dinner in peace. Does this focus on some of the women in leadership of these cooperatives influence you to write more about women's leadership in general?
Certainly does. Yeah, to me, Hamer, I remember Belinda Robnett, a sociologist, who said that we celebrate these women activists for all that they do, but fail to celebrate them for all that they said. And one of the things that struck me throughout this was how gendered it is to sort of consider Ella Baker an organizer and not a creative master, not an essayist, not a storyteller, or Fannie Lou Hamer as an organizer, someone who can just tell it like it is off the top of her head without thinking that maybe she fashioned that stuff carefully. Why is, that given the right to say that kind of thing about Du Bois and Schuyler, but not Baker and Hamer? And I hope I have the opportunity to tell other stories that sort of supplant that gendered logic of activism in the future.
So one last question. This is a really good one from Joseph Entin. He says, thanks for your brilliant work, and he would love for you to say more about your desire to strike a sharp contrast between the now and the future, between the actual in the present and the possible on the horizon. Don't many cooperatives also embody a dream of a future society, a cooperative one? Can we have it all, a movement that can be grounded in the now and also entail a speculative utopian dimension? I told you it's going to be a good one.
Absolutely, Joseph. And thank you for that live question, for sure. You're bringing us there, and I'm just going to take us there for a quick second before we break for dinner. But the idea of when you get into the book, you'll see that my definition of cooperation is two operations working side by side, a co-operation, a dual operation of that future goal and a now goal that work in tension with each other. And the utopian horizon and the present oceanic context that work in tension with each other. And indeed, I think that they're both in the same room. So yeah, thanks for that. I'm so happy you tuned in. Absolutely. Okay.
It is always the custom of the Caxton Club to do two things. First of all, I want to thank you for this wonderful, wonderful talk. And I want to tell you that Irvin is completely courageous. Over a year ago, as a blind email, but after having done some research about who could write a wonderful review of Kevin Young's African-American poetry for our Caxtonian, and having received the same name from two people, I did not know that name, but I'm maybe not that shy. We were able to search him out, and he did indeed write that review. So for Caxtonians, please go back and do your homework. And for those of you who don't have that, you could email me and you'll get a PDF of that article. It was an absolutely fabulous review. So I want to thank you publicly tonight for doing that and for just answering blind emails, which takes a lot of courage in itself. Now, in the second thing I wanted to say is the oldsters have failed. Well, I have to say this about the Caxton Club. We are beginning our 127th year. We have no intention of failing anytime soon. We may have some oldsters, but like in wine, sometimes older is better. So I want to remind you all of that. And now I'm going to do what I'm actually supposed to do, which is to present you what has been a great Caxton Club tradition. It is a custom of the Caxton Club to present our speaker with a book signed by all present. This is one of our books, and many of you have already seen this plenty, but I want to tell you something else. Throughout the pandemic, come what may, despite bad postal service, each speaker has always received a specially dedicated book. We are glad to be back. We're alive and well, and we're not that old. Thank you again for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you.